Ah, the oldest profession in the world, selling the thing that most people want to some degree or another, sex. There are few other trades as recession-proof as prostitution. In the 21st century, most forms of prostitution are illegal in my country, and in many others. The exception being if the language used to describe the process is euphemistic enough, or if you film the act and promise you'll put it on the internet. In the wellspring of misogyny, slavery, and general horror that is ancient Greece, prostitution had a mixed reputation and legacy. As we'll see, it changes on a case-by-case basis. Often it's a horrifically exploitative practice, similar to what we today would call grooming, sex trafficking, or pimping. Other examples show how sex work was one of the few opportunities for some to go from a destitute class without rights to a wealthy and secure one in a world that was both classist and sexist. So from the off, prostitution seems to have been extraordinarily common in most of Greece, especially going into the 5th century BCE. This is because there was such a demand for it. To start with, women were almost always married before their 20th birthday to men who were rarely married before the age of 30. And for women, in a society where there was little hope for the entire gender to go it alone in almost any profession, failing to find a marriage to somebody who could support them before their 20s basically meant that marriage was no longer a likely option. For men, waiting until they were 30, alternatives were often sought after in their young life. As we saw last episode, they often looked to other male lovers, but the demand for prostitutes was probably also fed by this late age of marriage. On top of that were the two things that the Greeks were best at: overseas trading and overseas war. Trade fueled the prostitution industry as a large class of merchants and sailors developed. Throughout history, sailors have always been associated with prostitutes due to their lifestyle, that is, not being able to stay in one place for any lengthy amount of time. As a result, famous port cities like Corinth, which dominated Greek trade for a fair bit of the 7th and 6th centuries, were also famous for their prostitutes. The two popular deities of Corinth are, after all, Poseidon and Aphrodite, the god of the sea and the goddess of love and sex. The Greek word Corinthiasian even translates to fornicate. Corinth actually becomes exceptionally well known for its hookers. The Temple of Aphrodite that stood as one of the most spectacular and sacred sites in the city also acted as a huge brothel. Pindar, a poet from the same time, even name-drops it in one of his little stories. In the 464 Olympic Games, a Corinthian named Xenophon won the pentathlon and gave 100 new prostitutes to the Temple of Aphrodite as a little thank you. Where all these new employees might have been sourced is a slightly more nefarious matter. That second thing that the Greeks loved doing, warfare, between both other Greeks and barbarians. This kept the sex worker industry afloat in two ways. Firstly, the same principle that applies to sailors also works for soldiers. Groups of men who rarely stay in one place for any long time, and are often faced with the possibility of never returning home, tend to gravitate towards sex workers for some reason. This is a human history thing as opposed to just being a purely ancient Greek thing. Historically, armies have usually been followed by a large baggage train full of prostitutes. The second way is a little more sinister. The ancient Greek economy was largely run on a slave trade, and warfare was one of the best ways to acquire new slaves. The humiliation of a defeated enemy in the ancient world often had a bizarrely sexual dynamic to it. A lot of emphasis is put on the annihilation of a bloodline, which the Greeks believed lived only through the male genes. So the defeat of an enemy is often followed by the execution or castration of their men, and the rape of their women. This obviously varied from culture to culture a tad. Famously, the Romans and Celts would have issues with each other over the treatment of prisoners. As to the Celts, a woman's chastity was a religiously sacred thing, regardless of her status, whilst to the Romans, it was a soldier's right to do what he wished with those he took prisoner. To the Greeks, though, the status of a woman captured in war was that of a trophy, either to be kept, as Achilles does to Briseis in the Iliad, or more often to be sold. And so it was that many women found themselves becoming streetwalkers, wearing sandals with the Greek for "follow me" written on the sole to indicate to men what her profession was. These lowest form of prostitutes were fairly recognizable in the street. In the early 4th century, the comic poet Eubolus said of the street prostitutes in Athens, "They're plastered with layers of white lead, their jowls smeared with mulberry juice, and if you go out on a summer's day, 2 rills of inky water flow from your eyes, and the sweat walling from your cheeks to your throat makes a vermilion furrow, whilst the fairs blown about your face look grey, they are so filled with white lead." To be honest, it's no wonder they were such a sorry sight to behold. I can't imagine Athenian prostitutes had a lot to invest in their looks. Their prices were kept artificially low in order to suit the city's ideology. Because you see, prostitution was seen as an essential service to the Athenians, one that should be available to all. Athens being the heart of democracy and the only place in Greece where, theoretically speaking at least, a man was judged on merit and not on wealth, so the Athenians were determined that even their brothels share in a feeling of equality. Therefore, a policy supposedly started by Solon of buying female slaves and then opening state-run brothels became a thing. The idea of this was to keep prostitutes cheap so that everyone in the city could always buy one for the low price of only one obol. Quick side note, an obol is not a lot at all. It's basically impossible to accurately figure out anything resembling an exchange rate between ancient currency and our own modern money, but I'm gonna go ahead and try anyways. So 6 obols makes a drachma, or a handful of coins. Your most skilled professionals, i.e. doctors, sculptors, etc., would make 5 or 6 drachma a day. A totally unskilled labourer could still reliably expect a daily wage of 3 obols to 1 drachma worth of payment. A prostitute in an Athenian state-run brothel costs the same amount as a loaf of bread, and would need to take between 3 and 6 clients per day to make the same amount of money as the lowest paid members of society. So it's no wonder they couldn't afford high-end makeup. They found ways around this though. The poorest sex workers were easy to spot because between clients they would spin wool to supplement their income. This only fed the stereotypes that most Greeks held about sex workers, that they were thrifty with money. There's a number of reasons for this. To start with, they're amongst the only women in society to ever handle money, so that's something. In the case of Athens, certainly, these would be some of the only women to live off their own independent income. But on top of that, they were selling a product that sadly lost value with age. Prostitutes would have known that if they failed to save enough money before old age to last them, they would be forced to continue to try and work. As a result, they develop a reputation as penny pinchers. Not all of them though, because some, from a young age, become absolutely minted. So in the 4th century BCE, male nude statues had been around for a good few hundred years. Female nudes were comparatively rare though. This was until at least Praxiteles of Athens was commissioned to make a statue of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. He made this showing the goddess as daringly nude. However, he knows that he's taking a massive risk by doing this, so he also makes a clothed version, just in case his nude doesn't really land with the audience. So when it comes to selling his statue, the people of the island of Kos get first choice about which one they want. So they visit Praxiteles' workshop, and they're horrified at the idea of a female deity portrayed in heroic nude, something that was more or less always reserved for men, and instead they took the dressed statue. This means that when the people of Cnidos come knocking, asking if Praxiteles has a statue for them to put in their newly finished Temple of Aphrodite, all the sculptor has is that rubbish naked one that seems to offend everyone. But the people of Cnidos take it, and lo and behold, it becomes a tourist attraction, and the island of Cnidos becomes famous throughout the Greek world as home of this statue. The people of Kos even change their minds, and they offer to pay the Cnidians huge debts off if they would just exchange statues, which is an offer that they obviously refused. The statue was so exceptionally beautiful because of its model, Praxiteles' lover and a high-class courtesan called Phryne. So she's part of a class of women that were amongst the only members of their entire sex to be valued for their intellect as well as their body. In fact, Phryne is famous really for those two things alone, her outstanding beauty and her quick wit and sharp mind. One time she's having dinner with Praxiteles, and he is so fond of her that on top of the payment that she already demands, he also offers her the opportunity to take for herself anything from his vast and expensive collection of statues. Phryne is flattered and asks, well, which of your statues is the best? He responds by saying he loves them all equally, which is code for, I know that being a gold digger is your literal job, but fat chance am I going to make it that easy for you. Phryne seemingly accepts this and continues with dinner. But not long after, however, one of her slaves bursts in. Yeah, Phryne had slaves. She might have technically been a sex worker, but make no mistake about it, she is immensely wealthy and very much a part of the aristocratic circle. Where was I? Oh yeah. One of her slaves bursts in and screams that the studio is on fire. Praxiteles then starts crying and laments, no, not my beautiful statue of Eros, and at this point Phryne reveals that she has tricked Praxiteles and takes his statue of Eros. Surprisingly, the sculptor finds this endearing and goes on to use his lover as his model. His work is so excellent that the Greeks had a saying that when Aphrodite first saw her statue, she exclaimed, when did Praxiteles see me naked? Phryne's charm and beauty is rivaled only by her wit. Once, whilst propositioning a potential client, she found the man in question to be totally unresponsive to her flirtations. Obviously this is something that Phryne is not used to, but she has a quick response to the situation, saying that she hadn't realised that she was sitting next to a statue, not a man. So, what was my point again? Oh yeah, smart, funny, beautiful, and here we go. Phryne was insanely rich. When Alexander the Great sacks Thebes, the largest city in Phryne's home region of Boeotia, she pays for the reconstruction of the settlement's walls. After charitably paying for this immense project, she has an inscription carved into the bottom saying, "Destroyed by Alexander, restored by Phryne the Hetaire." It's really interesting to see that A. Phryne managed to become so rich after her life as a refugee, fleeing from a destroyed home, rich enough to actually patronize these huge architectural feats, and B. that her position in society doesn't seem to be anything that she was ashamed of. She didn't need to say that she's a sex worker on her inscription, but she does it anyway. Maybe the status she held because of her work and her unique position as a financially independent woman in ancient Greece was something that she took pride in. Nobody knows, because very little is known about Phryne generally speaking, but it's fascinating to contemplate. Phryne wasn't the only Hetaire making a name for herself. Thias, an Athenian courtesan, would accompany Ptolemy on his campaigns with Alexander the Great. One account even has her being the first to suggest the burning of Persepolis, which more or less ruins Alexander's reputation with the Iranians for the rest of history. After Alexander's death, Ptolemy takes her to Egypt, where they become sort of married. Leontion, who was probably a Hetaire, although the jury is still out on that one a tad, was also one of the few female philosophers to gain recognition in her time. She was famously a student of Epicurus, who thought very highly of her. And then there's Nicorete, who is a more grey area type case. She'd probably been born a slave, but then freed by her master, probably when she was a teenager, and then she moves to Corinth, which we've already established is basically the red light district of Greece, and started up her own business. She would buy very young girls from the slave market, and then raise them herself to be sex workers. She would then make a fortune off them, and sell them on when they got too old. Now, because slave prostitutes were cheaper than freedwoman prostitutes, Nicorete told her customers that her girls were not slaves, so that she could charge even more for them. She ends up being caught out, though, and she's prosecuted. And I should probably also point out at this point that women making money, being educated, and generally being allowed to talk was fairly normal amongst the eastern Greek cities, but much more discouraged in the western ones. Nicorete was feeding the darker side of the Greek sex trade. The slavery, the poverty, the exploitation, etc., which just goes to prove how diverse the industry was at the time. Prostitution offered women a degree of personal freedom and influence that they could not enjoy through any other means. This is in cases like Phryne, Leontion, and of course Aspasia, who very much deserves her own video. But for by far the majority of these women, the career was involuntary, something that they were driven to by poverty or made to do by their slave status. A great deal of them would find themselves valued at the same price as a loaf of bread, and looking like this, only to be forced into retirement or sold when they got too old, and then probably dying in the street with no means to support themselves. So, a mixed bag, really. I guess the takeaway is, sometimes a thing can be good and bad at the same time, in different ways. I don't know, maybe let's go with slavery is wrong. That's not really a controversial thing to say nowadays, but I'm sure the Greeks themselves would have disagreed with me. Thanks for watching.